There's something that I witnessed when I was in Australia a few weeks back. We're doing some work there, and I saw something spiritually that to me was very remarkable. And it had to do with that there was, it was an event I was doing with John Morton. I don't know if many of you know who he is, but he's my friend. He's also a spiritual teacher and the spiritual director of a group called the Movement of Spiritual Inner Awareness, which I work with and I'm part of. But at one point, while the sharing was going on from the spirit world, I saw Jesus come into the room. And as he came in, he said, I'm going to lift what he called the Satanic Veil. And I didn't know what that was. But what I witnessed was he lifted something off and we pulled it back. It created an opening for everybody who was present to come into a direct communion with Spirit that was unavailable to them to that point. And so that was very fascinating to me to watch how that happened. And I thought, well, that would be really valuable to people to get more insightfulness about that and what that is. And so the last number of weeks in my meditation and my own process, I've been looking at what that meant and how to understand what happened there and what that's really about. And so in looking at what did that really mean, I asked in my own meditation, what is that and what just really happened? So it was explained to me that this could be understood metaphorically or as a story. There's a story that we've all heard of, which is the story of the Garden of Eden. And the Garden of Eden is Adam and the Garden of Eden, the eating of the fruit of the tree. So as it was so I'm going to share with you what was explained to me. I don't know if it's true. I'm just how it was explained to me so I could understand what was going on. So the Garden of Eden could be understood as the soul in a state of pure connection to the guidance of Spirit. And since this workshop is called Awakening into Grace, it is in the garden, Adam then in the beginning is in a state of pure grace because he is totally open to the Father who he communicates with, or God, if we want to call it, the Father, Mother, God. I don't really care what you call it, but that higher source that brings guidance. And the story goes through how Adam goes through the process, and he's the one who's naming all the animals and creation. And at one point, the idea is that God says, I'm going to give you a helpmate. And then out of Adam's rib, the helpmate then becomes the one known as Eve. And then in the story, Eve then is tempted by the serpent in the garden to eat of the fruit of the tree whom God has told Adam to not partake of, which is the tree of knowledge, or the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And Eve partakes and convinces Adam to partake of the fruit of the tree, and then Adam and Eve then are cast out of the garden and must go out and live by the sweat of their brow and, in a sense, start the travails of life, a life in separation from that primal essential guidance of God that was there and that they had. So when I look at this, when this was explained to me, I thought, and I looked at it, one of the things that occurred to me is that in the Judeo-Christian tradition, which is very a male-centric patriarchal tradition, even though the Jewish line comes down through the mother, through the female, yet the story of Adam and Eve is kind of like, well, Adam was God's boy, and he was a little lonely, so God said, Adam, I'm your daddy, so here. I'm gonna take care of you so you're not too lonely. And it really, to me, really seems to put the woman in a lesser place in a sense that she exists out of Adam. But it was explained to me that that's kind of a misunderstanding of that metaphorically what we're really talking about is that the soul, by its nature, is in such a pure state that it is, in itself, it is restricted in its level of participation in the life we lead here, simply because it is so accepting and it is so at peace with whatever happens that it is fundamentally not designed to become attached. And because it's not designed to become attached to anything, it's very hard to get into this game of life and to get all the lessons that life teaches, because the fundamental thing that holds us here is attachment. And so the way this whole process is designed, and this is something that's been taught in MSIA and through some other groups, is that when our soul is going to enter into this world, it gets paired with another consciousness. And sometimes it's called the basic self. But what it is, it's another consciousness that is also evolving, but that is more geared to this level. And it's geared to this physical level, and it's geared to the senses. And when the soul links with this other consciousness, and these come together as us, along with another consciousness, we could call it higher consciousness or higher self, which sort of knows God's plan for us and our plan that we set up when we were coming into this world. And that combination of these three selves, if you want to call it this higher self, the soul, and this we'll call it this basic self, or this more sense-directed self, is the formulation of a human being in the level of consciousness. So the thing that was interesting to me is this is being shown to me, one of the things I understood is that this that we call the basic self, in the metaphor of that story, in a sense is Eve. And that's why they say he was constructed out of the rib of Adam, because the basic self energetically always sits right here at the apex of the rib cage. And so, in a sense, in the Bible it says, I will give you a helpmate. And so the basic self is the soul's helpmate to be able to engage with creation, to learn the great lesson that is to be learned by coming into this world. So I like that version better because I think it fits the God I know, which is not the male form is superior and the female form is sort of an afterthought. It's really more like, no, it's really expressing the purpose of God's involvement. Now, when we look at that whole story and we go, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, so we're talking about entering to dualistic thinking and the process of judgment. Because if we're saying good and evil, well, how do we know if it's good or evil? We have to evaluate it. So therefore, we have to then look at a thing through the dualistic consciousness of right and wrong, good and bad, evil. And so once we enter into the involvement with this level where there's judgment, we get involved in that great process that the Hindus call karma. And because we're held accountable for those judgments, we're held responsible for those things that we judge in a strange sort of way. If we put a judgment upon things, we tend to bind ourselves to it. That's why the spiritual teachers have all talked about, judge not, lest you be judged, which is another way of saying is, don't get attached. Don't pass judgment. There's a saying that says, judgment is mine, thus saith the Lord. So let God do the judgment and let's stay out of that for us. So the serpent in the Bible, or that force that seduces us towards that, the partaking of that, when I was meditating about it, said, well, that the serpent, another name for the serpent, to understand that, is Satan. And Satan could be understood as the way that fallen angel who was called Lucifer operates into the material world, the physical world. And it's almost like that's the face he shows in the physical world. And so if we then go back to what we were talking about earlier about the, Adam. Well, the language that God spoke to Adam in is called the Adamic language. And what happened is that when Adam, in a sense, partook of the fruit of the tree, his ability to directly receive that communication from God was interfered with. And the interference that was come over it was that a veil was dropped across that, which is called the Satanic Veil, which is the veiling of this thing we call Satan upon the ability for us to receive of the Adamic language. And see, for me, all of us are Adam, because Adam is a metaphor of what all souls start as and what all souls are going back to return to that. I was told by my teacher, John Roger, many, many years ago that I had come back into the world when I came back in to teach two things, which was intuition and inner knowing. Intuition is the whole thing that people see, which is the ability to know things, whether it's to know things about people or past lives or the future. That's an intuitive process. The knowing process, to me, stems out of this Adamic language. It's the ability to know directly God's will and to know and to see and to share God's view or the Spirit's view on what's going on. So this is kind of what I was talking about, as I thought would be interesting. So if we're talking about awakening into grace, we're really talking about returning back to the grace consciousness or the grace state that we were in originally. Then, in a sense, paradise lost, or the fall from the garden, is falling out of this state of grace or this state of attunement. And it really doesn't matter what words we put on it. If we could tell the same story in the Judeo-Christian tradition, or if you went to the Buddhists and you talked about where Buddha is tempted by Mara, the deceiver, in a sense, all the traditions in their own way are saying that fundamentally we start with a position of connectedness and we get tricked or beguiled away from that. And what we're trying to do is to shake off this thing that clouds our ability to get this direct connection, this direct attunement, this direct discourse with God that is inherently who we are and what we are meant to have. And that, to me, is a big part of grace. The grace state is when we have that connection going. And so it's like we're getting the guidance. We may still choose away from it. We can choose out of it. I mean, if you take that story, Adam was told, do not eat of this tree, of the fruit of this tree, and he got beguiled into it. And this world has a lot of beguilements for all of us. But I'm hoping that today was going to be an opportunity for people to get back to that attunement, that first attunement that we all started with, to throw off that would keep us from it, which I'm sharing that the name I was given from the Spirit is sometimes called the Satanic Veil. It's the Satan's veil of the atomic. Now, I don't care about the name of Satan. I'm not a big names of this or that from that point of view, because it doesn't matter what you call it. It's what it really is. It's an intent to pull your consciousness into involvement with duality in such a way that it blocks you from that pure communication with who you are, with who God has made you, and that higher presence of God that would guide you in your lives. And so when we get back in touch with that guidance, that's when our lives start to be full of grace. It doesn't mean we won't have challenges, doesn't mean that we won't be tested. It means that there'll be a guiding conscience there that we'll be able to hear and follow, and that guiding consciousness will be available to us to show us the highest way, the most direct way through the dilemmas of our lives. And that, to me, is a life of grace. So that's kind of an intro into what I'd like to see happen here for you today. I saw that veil pulled back for people, and it was quite remarkable to watch what happened. But it doesn't necessarily mean there'll be bells and whistles and people all of a sudden be speaking in tongues. It's often, when I saw it happen, people went very, very still inside and very at peace and very joyful and quiet. It was interesting to watch how it kind of went across the room. And it was like the restlessness of people's chatter and disturbance started to just kind of go, slow down. And there was peace present in a way I rarely see. So I thought, well, we can ask. Maybe we can get some of that today. So that's my version of that story. I'm not claiming it's right. I'm just claiming it that when I asked about it, that's how I understood it. It made more sense to me than the way it had been explained to me before, because the way it had been explained for me before just didn't fit my experience of living. See, I do have the ability to see past lives, something I've probably had for more than half my life, where I could just do it all the time. And everybody I look at in this process, they've all been men and they've all been women. So it's very hard for me to see the female as a lesser form than the male, because I see the soul, and the soul doesn't see one lesser than the other. So it's hard for me to imagine that God sees one lesser than the other when the soul doesn't, because it's just a different experience. So if that makes me a feminist supporter, I guess so. I can't see a difference, because there is no difference spiritually other than it's a different mechanism to have a different expression.